the Lego construction ability relationship with mathematics. So first of all, Lego construction ability was also correlated with mathematical ability. That was our first objective to see. So there was a significant correlation between them, quite interesting in 7-year-olds. And this relationship between Lego construction ability and mathematical achievement seems to have been transmitted to visual-spatial working memory. That's what the mediation analysis is good for, basically, to try to argue about kind of potential, it's not definitive evidence, but potential causal pathways between these constructs and visual-spatial short-term memory. So that was our initial hypothesis. If we assume that visual-spatial memory is related to construction tasks, then can we also find that Lego construction or construction ability in general is related to math ability? Yes, we could confirm this. And is this relationship transmitted through memory? Yes, we could also confirm this with our mediation analysis. So there is a very intertwined relationship between three-dimensional construction ability, visual-spatial memory, and mathematical achievement. And the long-term promise here, obviously, could be that we could use these construction tasks to boost mathematical ability, perhaps in children. This is pretty much work in progress, just like one demonstration of how we can do educational neuroscience as such. So we carried out all of these basic studies, and then we try to establish how we can bring these studies to the classroom. So you can see the translational aspect working here. So how can we translate basic neuroscience into something which may be useful for the classroom? So this is one shot at that, basically. And I think, yeah, do I still have time? Because I wasn't sure how long this should be. Yeah? Okay. So, and another aspect, thank you. Another aspect we studied, so Lego construction ability, that was the previous one. Another aspect we studied is logical reasoning skill in developmental dyscalculia and in gifted children. Yeah, that's a great example. Yes? Interestingly, previously we couldn't find anything about the relationship between logical reasoning skill and mathematical achievement, not even in gifted children. There was some kind of evidence, but nothing really systematic, which is surprising because you could expect logic to be very related to math argumentation. Obviously, this is an example for adults, so we didn't test the children with this particular question here, but you can see that it's not absolutely trivial to solve these problems. They are very verbal problems, and you probably have to visualize them quite a lot, yes? And the picture helps a lot as well. It gives you all the visual clues you may need to solve the problem, or just to confirm that you have solved the problem. And for children, we can give something similar. So, for example, this could be a problem for children which is closer to their range of experience, perhaps. And we tested this kind of logical reasoning skill because the problems are only verbal, but probably visual argumentation helps you solve these problems. And we previously, in the same investigation, found that visual spatial memory and map skills are very related to each other. Now, we can expect that this kind of argumentation may be again related to visual spatial memory and visual spatial argumentation, thinking. So we could expect that both of them will be related to mathematics. And again, this is published in Developmental Science, so that can be looked up there if you find it interesting. Children solve these kinds of transitive inference problems. So the deep structure of these can be expressed as such. So these describe various relations between these sentences. And there were 8 so-called belief-laden problems. This means that they could be believable or unbelievable. So the believable ones could be like, the conclusion could be like elephants are bigger than mice. Yes, this fits your everyday experience, it's very believable. An unbelievable, just stop for it, waiting for the microphone. An unbelievable problem could be something like rabbits are stronger than gorillas. This is unbelievable in real world, but it can be it can be the right solution in terms of the inference problem you are having on the spot. And there were so-called belief-neutral problems, which didn't have this kind of fallback on everyday experience. So like the panda is behind the giraffe. It's unlikely you have a belief about the panda or the giraffe being closer or behind anything. Or Sarah is older than N. These were non-visual. Of course, you may know somebody called Sarah and N, but it's very unlikely all of the children would have this problem. That would look really strange. So these were, again, characteristically different types of problems we could give to our children. And the results are here. So we had 3 groups of children, and these were the same children who participated in our large study. So they were drawn from that large population, and we had all these tests done with them as well. So this was one of our experimental investigations run. So this group is a high maths or gifted mathematics group. So these children better than population average plus 1 standard deviation. So they were outstanding in terms of our sample in mathematics achievement. The control children, the same one we used before. So these were typically developing average achievers. And the children with developmental dyscalculia, so they were performing badly or weakly, so to say, in mathematics. And then you can see valid problems here with valid conclusions. If that conclusion was believable, then we don't see much of a difference between our groups. However, if that conclusion was unbelievable, then you can see a massive difference between these groups. So basically, if the conclusion goes against your everyday experience, that's when children really had to rely on their logical reasoning skills here. And the gifted mathematicians were much better than the typically developing ones and the children with dyscalculia as well. So this is an interesting observation, actually, because as you see, these problems are kind of verbal problems. Actually found that verbal working memory wasn't related too much to math understanding, but these problems can be evaluated very strongly in terms of their visual content, and we do find that the good mathematicians who also show very good visual spatial memory perform much better than typically developing children and children with developmental dyscalculia. And you can see the same pattern in case of the invalid outcome problems. If those conclusions were believable, then you can see a large separation between the 3 groups. If they were unbelievable, that is your conclusion and your everyday experience reflected the same, so there was not much to think about, so to say, in a sense, or your everyday experience could help you in problem solving, then you don't see a discrepancy between these groups. So again, the gifted mathematicians were better than the other 2 groups in this case as well. So logical reasoning seemed to be very strongly related to mathematical problem solving. However, one more thing to notice, if we look at these belief-neutral problems, which didn't have visual content, and they are here, then you can see that the 3 groups were not too different from each other. Even here, or even here, and this is a non-significant difference. You see some tendency already, and here there is a tendency certainly, but the separation between the 3 groups was actually non-significant in this case. So if there was no strong visual content to fall back on in these problems, then between the 3 groups with different mathematical achievements, we did not see such a strong difference. Again, I think the whole thing exemplifies that perhaps children relied a lot on visual spatial argumentation to solve these problems, and that's how the gifted math children have their advantage, exploiting that kind of argumentation. And in case of these visualizable problems, that was very useful, but in case of the non-visualizable problems, actually they could not exploit that kind of strength. And that's another message for mathematics, that perhaps those problems require, again, even a more abstract level of argumentation, a non-visual argumentation, which may be another developmental step to be taken a bit later. And that shows perhaps a difference between logical argumentation and mathematical achievement at this age range. So the two are related, but maybe not in all types of problems. And that reflects the complexity of math as we started. So math is really complex. It involves lots of processes. Perhaps these children can use visual spatial memory to help them solve certain types of math problems, certain types of logical problems, but not all kinds. They have to have another kind of developmental step for solving those problems. So all the complexity of mathematics, I think, is there, and we really have to look at this so that we can understand all of the patterns of results. So far, just to summarize, visual spatial memory and short-term memory and working memory was related to developmental dyscalculia and math achievement. Inhibition function seemed weak in developmental dyscalculia. Logical reasoning skills were also impaired in developmental dyscalculia, and they were particularly good in gifted mathematician children. But perhaps we had interesting dissociations between different types of logic, memory function, and mathematical function. And construction tasks may serve as potential intervention tasks, perhaps, to improve mathematical skills in children. And a last domain I want to talk about, just very briefly, which is not the focus here. I will include it in the workshops tomorrow, is the emotional aspects of mathematical learning. This is extremely neglected in general. Not too much research has been done on this, whereas if you think about the importance of motivation, anxiety regarding academic performance, it's obviously extremely important to deal with the emotional aspects of academic learning and mathematics learning especially. We know that mathematics has a very serious ability to elicit substantial anxiety from lots of people who may be afraid to solve mathematical problems. I heard about some observations of anxiety for statistics in psychology students, even here. And I have observed it even in Cambridge various times. So lots of children and adults are kind of afraid of math or afraid of doing some kind of math. They don't feel comfortable with it. And this definitely has even a research literature which should grow much more, in my opinion. And actually we are running a large study on this in the UK, which involves again around 2,000 children, where we study math anxiety, as it's called, and its relation to mathematical achievement and any kind of academic achievement, and its relation to anxiety disorders in general in children. So that's one of my large projects running now in the UK, so I will know much more about this phenomenon in about a year. That's my wish. And we also work with cooperators in China, so I will be very interested in comparing cultural data from this point of view. And what I can show here is this published study, which was our pilot in the United Kingdom. So this was our initial investigation to look into the phenomena, and what we find if we just take a UK sample. We were particularly interested in gender differences because just based on observation, there may be some strong gender factors here, and we know that there are stereotypes about boys, girls being better or worse in mathematics, so gender is an interesting thing to study. And what we found, you can see test scores here in a standardized scale, so 0 is the population average. And on a math test, we found that boys and girls performed practically the same, so there was no difference in their mathematical achievement at all. However, you already noticed that in math anxiety and test anxiety, so anxiety specific to mathematics and anxiety specific to testing situations, girls had considerably higher scores than boys in both cases, basically. So importantly, the achievement of girls was not different. They were having the same math results, but they were much more anxious about what they were doing. And now, I have already looked at our new data set, and last year we had another data set with around 1,000 children from Italy, and they show the same, basically. That's in progress. But girls already in primary school, year 3, year 4, show substantially higher levels of mathematics anxiety. In fact, they have shown substantially higher levels of anxiety for everything. It's very interesting, but already in primary school. And we had secondary school samples there, and it's kind of unchanged. If anything, it is increasing, this kind of anxiety. Actually, in both genders, academic anxiety is increasing throughout schooling, and women's higher scores just stay higher during the whole time of schooling. Are these reflecting truly higher levels of anxiety in objective terms? Not clear. Maybe it's only reflecting more willing self-report, more willingness to admit anxiety. It's not very macho to admit anxiety on behalf of the boys, but even if it is kind of self-report, it's very significant. If I perceive myself as anxious, it will definitely affect my behavior. So it's not that subjective self-report is completely invalid. It is extremely valid because that's how I perceive myself, for example. Yes. So these gender differences in higher anxiety, I think, are extremely important to consider. They probably are very socially constructed, social origin, because we have this, as I mentioned, stereotypes about math being a male domain, not being a girly domain. And we always found in all of these samples that the performance of girls and boys was exactly the same in math performance. So it's not that girls were any weaker. They were always the same or even slightly better, but they were always only much more anxious. So mathematics anxiety, as such, is one of the foci of our investigations at the moment, and how it relates to performance. The evil aspect of it, even if girls may perform at the same level, if they are more anxious about math achievement, and we know that one of the problems with math anxiety is that it results in avoidance. So on the longer term, maybe females will tend to drop out from math learning because of their math anxiety, not because of their incapability of learning math, but because they think that it just makes them nervous and think, so they try to avoid it. And obviously, if I avoid something, my skills will be less and less trained in it, so it's a self-amplifying process. Cultural differences are extremely important. I haven't seen our cooperators' data from China yet. I am very curious in what we find in the Chinese setting, in mainland China. I would be interested to study India, for example. In Cambridge, I have the impression that half of Indian girls are studying engineering. So it's very different from the UK cultural setting, where engineering is perhaps a much more, or definitely a much more male domain. And in, let's say, in some settings in India, it's just a natural pathway to, yeah, what do you want to do in university? Oh, yeah, I'll be an engineer. It doesn't matter what's your gender, seemingly. So these cultural factors are very important to take into account. So I would expect to find substantial differences in math anxiety and its relation to performance and career choices in various countries. We don't know too much about it, and what's generating math anxiety very early in development, that's another important question. There are signs that it may be kind of inherited from teachers to pupils, and often female teachers seem to have high levels of math anxiety, and it seems to be just inherited down to the levels of their own students in the school, or parents may transmit these anxiety further and their own gender stereotypes to children. So one very important thing to study for the future, I hope I can talk much more about this in about a year's time when our studies are all analyzed and processed. So all over, we talked about all of these aspects already. I would add mathematical anxiety as a very important factor to study. And so I talk more about the cognitive foundations, the cognitive basis of mathematics. But it doesn't mean that the emotional aspects are any less important. In fact, motivation is extremely important. It just means that we know much less about the emotional aspects of math learning. And I talked about potential interventions as well. So more or less, lots of these points are just very, very briefly reviewed in that particular editorial to that special issue I mentioned. And thank you. And here are all the colleagues who took part in this. So some staff and my students, previous and current, whose work was included in the talk. Thank you very much. And sorry for my occasional slowdowns. It's due to the my jet lag attacks.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Szűcs. So it's time for questions. So if you have any questions, I think it's a very invaluable opportunity for you to ask our distinguished guest here. So just a quick round of questions. Any one of you have some questions in mind? Yeah.
Well, not yet. That's one of our questions there. So we started a large project on this like more than a year ago. It's funded by the Nuffield Foundation in the UK, which is an education and charity. And one of our objectives is to respond to your question, whether we can predict any solutions. So in about a year's time, because there we do a large-scale testing project, but we also run qualitative interviews with children. So we try to, and that may be closer to the counseling profile I have seen here. So we try to look at their own experience. So, and we hope to learn from them how we can cope better with math anxiety.
Yeah, maybe.
Since you have identified that dyscalculia is caused mainly by weakness in spatial memory and working memory, then logically, if you want to design an intervention for these children, you want to target those areas, right? You want to strengthen their visual memory, you want to strengthen their working memory. Has there been any research that shows that by strengthening visual memory and working memory, that helps children with discovery?
Well, that was our objective with this Lego thing, to make the first step into this direction, obviously. So to see whether there is any activity we can use to strengthen these skills. And the construction task would be one potential avenue here. but we haven't done the study yet, as what you are asking basically would require longitudinal training design, yes, to map the causal relations. There is one serious problem with those designs: they are very expensive. So that's the only thing which stands in our way in providing some really definitive evidence. So running a well-powered, robust training study would require very large populations with very high effect sizes. There are, in our case, that's my response. But if you look at the research literature, it's patchy, because there have been some studies with targeted training, working memory, and looked at their impact on mathematical achievement. However, the training tools they used are very varied. So it's very hard to decide what was exactly trained. Often they are very underpowered. So how long is the training is very crucial. What effect size you can reach is extremely crucial. And what settings may be the best for transferring any kind of memory-specific training effects to the mathematical context is again unclear. I'm not sure if you would just train visual spatial memory per se, that may be useful in all cases. I would expect that you somehow have to link visual spatial memory and mathematical problem solving in the training context. Perhaps that may be the most efficient design here. So not clear whether we have such evidence. But the whole study was done because even just the connection between visual spatial memory or any cognitive skill or domain and mathematical weakness was in question. So that's kind of a first step. The training causal pathway would be a strong second or third step to take if we have a lot of funding.
I have two questions, but I think they're both very clear. For my ignorance, I'm just wondering why you prefer to use the term developmental with dyscalculia. I'm not really sure. I don't understand that. The reason why to link that word. And then the second question is about some research that I was doing with Brian, reading about Brian Butterworth, and he has a dyscalculia screener. And I wondered if you use that in your to screen for dyscalculia. I noticed that a couple of your tests, when you're looking at the big ladybird and the line and the visual grid that comes up, are both things that I think are involved also in the screener. In addition, I think he has another one as well.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. So why developmental? It's a usual term in the literature distinguishing developmental and acquired. Acquired dyscalculia could be some people unfortunately have math problems after a stroke or something like this. So, yeah, and developmental, the definition here is that is something which just appears out of nothing. So the child seemingly develops normally, there is no trauma, no special event, they just won't develop mathematics properly. That's when you use the developmental label, usually, in this literature. And the relation to the dyscalculia screener, our approach is very different. In these studies, I wasn't focusing on that, but basically, so it's a very, very big question to address. Yeah, like your question actually was a lot from this point of view. That could be another 2 talks, probably. But I will talk more about that in this workshop tomorrow if anybody comes. So our approach is very different. I didn't detail it very clearly, but we also examined in our studies this kind of number sense theory, which underlies the construction of the dyscalculia screener, called as such. And so we were not very confirmative of the number sense theory of dyscalculia. In fact, we tested all factors potentially having any relations with number sense as such. I'm not sure who is familiar with the number sense theory, who is not, so it's a bit difficult to talk about it in such a specific ways. But so that theory argues very strongly that there is one central, so to say, core sense of number. And this can be measured in various ways. We measured it in all the ways possible in our experiments. And in our between our dyscalculia group and typically achieving group, there were absolutely no differences in any of these measures. So basically, we couldn't confirm any of the number sense theory. That's a very prominent theory. If you look at our special issue, for example, on dyscalculia or our cortex paper, then it's argued in much longer terms what may be the issues about the number sense theory. So it's a very interesting question. It's a hot topic of research. Is that theory right? Is it wrong? I'm saying it's wrong, to put it very clearly.
I think we can take one more question for the time being. Maybe two, I think. Okay, yeah? Maybe a quick one.
Two simple ones. So is it inborn or?
Dyscalculia, it's a condition that is born, you are born with, or is it coming out of nowhere? Yeah, and the second question would be, putting together two of your thoughts, you said that the anxiety in maths is more in girls than in boys. And then later on you said that the anxiety can transfer from the teacher to the students. But we know that maybe, I don't know statistics, maybe 95% of the primary school teachers are females. Do we have a solution for this, or is it a problem?
It's a very important comment, and obviously may have a relation. But to start with the first one, so for example, the number sense theory would argue that there is a core area of the brain which is very strongly connected to math expertise, and maybe that area underdevelops, and that can result in dyscalculia. I don't really believe in this explanation, to tell it frankly. I don't think it's inborn. What may happen in my view, but we don't know, because that's what the whole research is about, to try to find out how we get this phenomenon. What I would think is that some cognitive skills which should be more developed just underdeveloped for some reason. Let's say visual spatial memory, if it's very important for math achievement, and now we have confirmed it many times, and there is a lot of literature, especially recently, which is confirming its importance for math, then maybe in some children these skills may be due to lack of practice or due to lack of interest in tasks or something is just not developing properly, or maybe it needs a very visual spatial memory and mathematics. Maybe you need to develop a very specific connection somehow between them, because it's not trivial how you exploit visual spatial memory, let's say, for mathematical performance. So you have to have kind of a link between them, know how you use your visual spatial argumentation for math. Maybe for these children, it's kind of a non-trivial connection. I'm only hypothesizing here, but I don't think it's an inborn weakness. I think it's just not developing for some reason. How we can provide the right environment, that would be this cognitive training question, for example, or how you can point these children to the direction of actually exploiting their visual spatial processes efficiently for mathematical functioning. For example, in some countries, people don't use the number line, I think, for math teaching. And if I think about my own experience, I was educated in Hungary, so if I think about that, I still remember this meters-long, huge number line on the wall, and that gave me all the meanings of the negatives, for example. And 0 was green, negatives are blue, and positives are red. And you still have these associations in your mind. And I do think probably even now it helps me to understand numbers. So these kinds of teaching aids and how they link memory and math together may be extremely important. And that's what we have to study, basically, how we can develop these right associations. So that was question one. About the other question.
Female teacher.
Yeah, the female, thank you. Excellent memory.
I have one here.
And sorry, I have to respond this one.
Sorry.
Finish
Just
about the female teacher.
I can't really respond it, but I'm sure that's an extremely important factor, because if the majority of teachers are female and they may be anxious about math, then they may very efficiently transmit this anxiety to males. Yesterday we had a chat, but that's one thing, but also environment is important. Yesterday we had a chat here about like single-sex schools, that they are, let's say, where girls are not exposed to boys. Maybe the stereotypes, even from female teachers, about math weakness are less expressed. These are all questions that we don't know clear responses, but it's a very important thing to study these factors. And I just note that